She didn't remember buying the cup. That was the first strange thing. There were many items in her home that had no story, gifts, heirlooms, or impulse purchases forgotten the moment they were shelved. But this one had a kind of weight to it. Not physical. Not the way porcelain carries density. It was the weight of having belonged elsewhere, as though it had once sat too long in someone else's silence. She found it tucked behind a row of mismatched mugs on a morning when the house felt a little too still, and her thoughts were spilling into places she didn't want to revisit. She was reaching for her usual, the wide-rimmed ceramic one with a chipped handle that always held just enough to feel like comfort, but her hand landed on this instead. It was delicate, ivory white with a faint blue glaze that shimmered only when light caught it just right. No maker's mark, no memory of purchase. Just there, waiting. Her fingers curled around the handle and paused. It wasn't cold. That was the second strange thing. Everything else on the shelf had the chill of untouched ceramic, but this felt warm, like it had just been rinsed and set down minutes ago. She blinked, confused but too tired to analyze it. The mind does that sometimes, makes up warmth in lonely places. She brought it to the counter, filled it with boiling water and chamomile, then carried it to the old armchair by the window, the one that creaked just enough to feel alive. She hadn't even taken a sip when the sensation arrived. Not a taste, not a smell, but a memory, or something like it. A garden, but not hers. She had never grown roses, never owned a fountain, never worn a linen dress that swept against damp grass. And yet, she could feel the soil under her nails, hear the trickle of water behind stone. The breeze carried music she didn't know she remembered, and there was someone laughing, lightly, distantly, like a bell on a faraway bicycle. Her chest tightened, not in fear, in familiarity, as if part of her had once lived there and left before understanding what it meant. She closed her eyes, just for a moment, and the image deepened. The sky above the garden turned orange with dusk, petals drifted across the stone bench, and a small dog, white with a blue collar, bounded through a line of hedges chasing shadows. When she opened her eyes again, her tea was untouched. Steam still rose, but the room felt different, wider, older. Or maybe it was her that had changed. Some part of her loosened, as though a memory not hers had found shelter and left behind a trail of belonging. She set the cup down, slowly, as though placing it too quickly might shatter something more fragile than porcelain. Her hands hovered, uncertain whether they belonged to her anymore. There had been no dizziness, no loss of control, only a shift, soft and unannounced, like a curtain drawn back without warning. She looked around the room, seeking evidence that she was still here, still herself. The same shelves lined the walls, the same ticking clock pressed on above the mantel, the same plant in the corner, with one yellowing leaf she kept forgetting to remove. But beneath all of it, a layer of something else had settled, like dust stirred from pages no one had read in decades. She stood and walked to the kitchen without purpose, her feet moving as though remembering a rhythm her mind didn't. The cup sat silent on the windowsill now, catching what little light the gray sky allowed through. She didn't touch it again that day. Instead, she busied herself with pointless tasks, reorganizing drawers, checking the mail twice, wiping down clean counters. But all of it happened through a haze, as if her body was moving through water while her thoughts clung to the edge of that garden. That unfamiliar memory was too detailed to be imagined, too whole. It hadn't come in pieces like dreams do. It had arrived complete, as though borrowed. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Her bed felt unfamiliar, the blankets too heavy in places they never had been before. She closed her eyes and waited for her own memories to surface. Old birthdays, quiet Sunday mornings, her mother's faded lullabies. But instead, the garden returned, uninvited, and yet welcome. She could hear the dog panting happily now, see the slight limp in its hind leg as it ran. The woman in the linen dress was humming to herself as she trimmed the rose bushes, careful and precise. And once again, The air was filled with that soundless music, like something meant to be remembered, but not spoken aloud. When she woke, the cup was already in her hand. She didn't remember getting out of bed, didn't remember walking to the kitchen. But there she stood, in the pale light of dawn, holding it gently as if cradling a bird too stunned to fly. The tea inside was still warm, not hot, not freshly poured, just recently known. She sat again in the armchair by the window, her fingers tight around the handle. She didn't drink. She didn't need to. The moment she closed her eyes, she was back in the garden, back in someone else's life. A life so tender and so far away, it ached like an echo in her chest. She began to notice details she hadn't paid attention to before, not in her own home, but in the memory. Each time she held the cup, more of it revealed itself. The garden's layout unfurled like a forgotten map, the lavender along the left wall, a rusted watering can tucked beneath the ivy, a cracked stepping stone with a child's footprint preserved in concrete. These were not vague impressions, but precise elements, fixed in space like truths long buried. There was a particular bench, wrought iron and painted white, with peeling edges and a cushion that never quite dried. Each time she visited, because that's what it felt like, visiting, a little more of that world became her own. She stopped questioning whether it was real. Real had become a slippery term. What mattered was that she remembered it now. Not imagined, not invented, but remembered. Like a chapter from a book she swore she had never read, yet could quote by heart. She never told anyone. There wasn't anyone left to tell. The house had been quiet for years. Friends had moved, drifted, or faded into Christmas card distance. And the few who remained wouldn't understand how a teacup could become a portal. So she kept it private, like a ritual. Every afternoon at the same time, when the light grew soft and the shadows stretched long across the floor, she'd make tea, not to drink, but to return. She didn't know whose memory it was. The woman in the linen dress was always turned away, always humming, always content in her solitude. The house connected to the garden never fully appeared, just its back door, painted green, and a fluttering curtain behind one window. Sometimes distant voices floated from beyond the hedge. Children, neighbors, nothing clear. Only fragments, the way memory preserves what it loves and blurs what it fears. But the emotion was constant. Peace, longing, a nostalgia that did not belong to her, yet fit inside her ribs as though it had waited years for room to grow. She began to notice things in her own world changing too, small things. She started planting again. At first, just a single pot of thyme on the sill, then basil, then a hydrangea that didn't quite fit the color of the remembered garden, but brought a similar stillness. Her steps grew softer, her days more measured. She moved through the hours as though they were something to tend to, not just survive. And always, always, the cup remained. It never chipped, never cracked. It stayed warm just long enough, as if it knew when she needed to go back. The garden was becoming a part of her, or maybe she was becoming a part of it. It wasn't just the garden that became clearer, it was the feeling that preceded it. A pause, soft and absolute, like standing on the edge of a forgotten photograph. Each time she touched the cup now, her breath steadied before the vision arrived. It wasn't something she could force, nor delay. The cup decided. The memory unfolded only when it was ready, like a letter written in invisible ink, revealing itself slowly beneath the heat of stillness. And in these moments, she felt herself dissolving into a rhythm that had nothing to do with her own past. She had never lived in such grace, had never trimmed rose bushes with such patience, had never known a silence so kind. One day, the scene shifted, not jarringly, but just enough. The garden was there, familiar and unchanged, but the woman was not alone anymore. A man appeared in the distance, not young, not old, his form half obscured by the overgrown archway. He moved as if he belonged there, as if he had always been just out of sight. She watched, without controlling what she saw, as the woman paused her humming, glanced upward, and smiled. It was a small smile, barely more than a twitch of the mouth, but it changed everything. That smile carried weight. It was the kind of smile that remembered, the kind that forgave. She didn't see their hands touch nor hear their voices, but she felt the current between them, the quiet ache of someone returning, or perhaps never having left, that undercurrent of time, held too tightly and then released. It brought a stinging warmth to her eyes. Not sorrow, not joy, just the ache of recognition. She didn't know who they were. She didn't know what they meant to each other, but she felt the memory settle inside her chest like a forgotten promise. The cup remained warm in her hands. Her own tea, still untouched, had begun to cool, but the warmth she carried didn't fade. Later that evening, she wandered through her backyard, which had never interested her before. She looked at the weeds climbing the fence, the cracked stones near the hose, the single wildflower that had forced its way through a corner by the wall. And for the first time in years, she didn't see what was missing. She saw what could be. Not a replication of the memory. She could never grow those same roses, never find that exact bench, but something parallel. A garden of her own, shaped by a memory she didn't own but was willing to honor. The next morning she bought gloves. She didn't need them yet, but something told her she would. She didn't tell the cashier what the gloves were for. It was easier to let them assume she needed them for housework or arthritis, but as she held the thin cotton bundle in her hand, she felt the memory press closer again, uninvited, but welcomed, like a whisper through a half-open door. She didn't plan to work in the garden that day. She only set the gloves down on the counter beside the teacup and watched the light filter through the window with a softness she hadn't noticed in years. The world had begun to slow down, not because her body demanded it, but because something else had shown her how. Later, as the evening approached, she took her tea without steeping it. Just hot water in the cup, held quietly. The ritual no longer needed flavor. It only needed presence. And as she curled her fingers around the cup once more, the memory returned with more weight than usual. This time, the woman in the linen dress was sitting, not pruning, not walking, just still. Her back rested against the bench, her arms folded gently in her lap. The man stood beside her now, not touching, not speaking, but present in the way trees are present in a long-forgotten grove. Timeless, rooted. A light breeze moved through the scene, rustling the tall grasses along the border of the path. The woman closed her eyes and leaned her head back, exposing the pale curve of her throat to the sky, as if trying to catch a memory of sunlight from years ago. The moment held. It didn't change. It didn't need to. In that silence, everything was already said. She watched, breath slowing, heart quieting, as the cup in her hands grew warm again, not from the tea, but from something much older. She stayed that way for a long time, not wanting to break whatever thread had been tied between their worlds, not questioning anymore why the memory had come. Perhaps it had been drifting, untethered, waiting for someone quiet enough to hear it, someone still enough to receive it. And perhaps the cup had only ever been a vessel, like her, a holder of echoes, a keeper of the almost forgotten. The idea didn't frighten her. It settled into her bones like something that had always been true, just never named. That night, when she turned off the lights and climbed into bed, the room felt neither empty nor full. It simply existed, as did she. Not in search of meaning, not in fear of solitude, but in quiet companionship with whatever had found its way into her life, through porcelain, through memory, through time. It became part of her life in a way she hadn't expected, this quiet, borrowed past. Mornings still belonged to habit, folding laundry, watering the kitchen herbs, standing at the window with a hand cupped around a mug she no longer drank from. But afternoons now held a gentle urgency, a soft anticipation. She would prepare the space, the armchair fluffed, the curtains drawn halfway to filter the light just so, the teacup rinsed, though it never truly needed rinsing. Then she would sit and wait. Not with impatience, but with the calm expectancy of someone visiting a loved one who only appears when the house falls silent enough. What returned to her was no longer just the garden. The memories had begun to shift, not forward in time, but deeper. Layers revealed themselves, as though she were walking through a house with endless rooms, each door opening to something both foreign and familiar. One afternoon, she found herself standing, within the memory, before a mirror. The reflection wasn't her own. The woman's hair was darker, pinned back in a style she never wore. The room was different, with wallpaper of faded florals and a vanity cluttered with perfume bottles and combs with broken teeth. And yet, there was recognition, not of self, but of presence, as though her soul had once leaned against these walls. The next day brought the sound of a piano. Just a few notes at first, hesitant, uneven. Then a melody formed, tender and halting. She couldn't see the room this time, only feel the vibration of wood beneath her hands. The memory wasn't visual, it was tactile. The way polished keys gave slightly beneath the pressure of fingers, the way old pedals stuck. She had never learned to play, but now, in the quiet, her hands twitched with longing, aching for a muscle memory that was never hers. The notes were clumsy, like someone relearning something lost, or someone trying to say something without words. She began to write things down, not out of fear of forgetting, but because she needed to make space in her own mind. Names came to her, not hers, places she had never been, with weather she had never felt. One evening, she scribbled a sentence in the margin of a notepad and stared at it for hours. The blue door creaked even when locked. It meant nothing, and yet it pulsed with truth. That night, she dreamt of the door, blue and peeling, with morning light leaking through the cracks. Behind it, silence. Not empty, not cold, just waiting. She wasn't frightened, but something inside her was shifting. The memories were no longer isolated moments. They were beginning to thread together. A life that wasn't hers was unfolding piece by gentle piece, and she wasn't sure where it ended. The cup began to feel heavier in her hands, not in weight, but in consequence. It no longer felt like an object. It felt like a threshold. Each time she lifted it, she could sense the difference between memory and moment, between being and remembering being. The lines blurred. Some days, she would pause at the cabinet, unsure whether to reach for it, not because she feared what she would see, but because she wondered if she would ever fully come back. The pull was stronger now, the return slower. She would emerge from the memories with her own name lingering like something borrowed, not born. One afternoon, the memory placed her in a hallway. Narrow, wall-papered, with framed sketches along the wall, charcoal renderings of flowers, hands, rooftops seen from a child's perspective. The light was low, not from dusk, but from curtains drawn for privacy or grief. She heard footsteps, soft, deliberate, belonging to someone who knew this house well. Hers? Or the woman's? It didn't matter. The air was thick with emotion too subtle to name. Not sorrow, not nostalgia. A kind of reverence, perhaps. The kind one feels walking into a church long after the congregation has gone. The hallway bent slightly left, and as she turned the corner within the memory, she felt herself hesitate. A room, pale blue walls, a sewing machine by the window, the kind powered by foot pedal, a table with mismatched buttons sorted into tiny jars, a red scarf, half finished, draped over the back of a chair. She had never sewn. Her fingers were clumsy with threads. But in that moment, she felt the smooth repetition of hands guiding fabric, the satisfaction of even stitches. And there, tucked under the windowsill, was the teacup, the same one, sitting in another life, on another day, waiting for someone else's hand. Her breath caught. She had never seen the cup in the memory before. It had always been the doorway, never the scenery. Now, it existed inside the dream. When she returned to herself, if that was the word for it, her living room felt colder. She stood up, walked to the window, and opened it just enough for the breeze to slip in. The trees outside were still bare, waiting for spring to arrive, but she noticed a single bud beginning to form on the edge of a branch, small, reluctant, brave. She touched the windowsill, then looked back at the cup on the table. It hadn't moved, It had never moved, but now it seemed to be watching. That evening, she wrote again. Not sentences this time, but lists. Colors she had never worn but now remembered loving. Foods she had never tasted but could recall the texture of. And names. Always names. Elodie. Marta. Rose. Each one echoing without origin. She didn't know which one belonged to the woman. Maybe all of them. Maybe none. But the memories were deepening. And so was she. There were mornings now when she would wake with a scent in her mind. Orange blossom. Or parchment. Or a kind of salt that didn't come from any sea she had ever known. It lingered behind her eyes, in the spaces between heartbeat and breath, refusing to explain itself. The memories were no longer tied strictly to the cup. They visited her without invitation, threading themselves into quiet moments, the way her feet touched the floor upon waking, or how her fingers paused over the faucet handle, uncertain whether the water would run cold or warm. There was no schedule anymore, no preparation. The past, someone else's past, had learned to enter through any open door. She found herself rearranging her shelves, not because they were cluttered, but because she kept catching glimpses of unfamiliar arrangements, books stacked differently, jars placed with odd precision. At first, she thought it was forgetfulness, age, a slip. But then, one morning, she walked into the kitchen and instinctively reached for a tin of tea she had never bought. It wasn't there. It had never been there. And yet her hand hovered, suspended in doubt, because she could see it. A small green tin with gold lettering, the lid slightly dented on the side. The name eluded her, but the ritual didn't. She could almost smell it steeping. Her hands remembered it. She began writing less and watching more, sitting for long stretches at the window, waiting for some sign, not of understanding, but of recognition. Once a woman passed by on the street wearing a scarf with a pattern of pale violets. Her breath caught. She had never seen that exact pattern before, but she had folded it. She had placed it carefully into a drawer with lavender sachets, next to a pair of gloves and a ribbon she hadn't touched in years. Except, of course, those things weren't hers. Still, her fingers twitched at the memory. It wasn't confusion. It was something else. Inheritance, maybe. Or haunting. Sometimes she wondered if the memories had been left behind on purpose. Not as warnings, not as riddles, but as acts of trust, as if someone, long gone, had needed to be remembered, not in words or photographs, but in sensation. And the cup had been the chosen vessel, not because it was beautiful or rare, but because it was held, because it had touched lips and warmth and pause again and again until it had absorbed something essential, not a story, a presence. She didn't fight it. She only grew quieter, more receptive. She walked slower now, not from frailty, but from a reverence for the unseen. The air around her felt thick with things unspoken, and though her own past remained intact, unremarkable, small, entirely hers, it had begun to rest lightly beside another life, a life gently blooming within her own. The change was not dramatic. There was no sudden unraveling of identity, no day she awoke uncertain of her own name. It was subtler than that, a soft erosion of borders between lives. She could still recall her childhood, her first apartment, the scar on her left hand from a kitchen mishap that taught her to respect boiling oil. But now, threaded between those memories, were others, a child's laugh echoing through a tiled courtyard, the weight of a letter never sent, the cold curve of a brass doorknob she had never turned but now missed in quiet moments. Her life had grown layered, like a palimpsest, the past beneath the past. She once caught herself humming while folding laundry, a tune with no lyrics, no origin, just a looping melody that calmed her hands. Later that day, she heard the same melody while dreaming, not through her ears, but through the stillness. The woman in the memory was humming it too while buttoning a pale green dress. It was then she realized these weren't just visions. They were impressions, echoes, and she was not merely witnessing them. She was participating. Her body remembered what her mind could not. Her muscles knew the weight of keys she had never carried. Her heart paused at names she had never spoken. The teacup, once a companion, had become something closer to a guide. Not every touch brought a memory now. Sometimes it brought silence, a rich, expectant silence, like the moment before a candle is lit. It taught her to wait, to feel, to trust that not everything forgotten is lost, and not everything unspoken is empty. She would sit with the cup and let her thoughts wander, not to her own worries, but to the questions that no longer needed answers. What color was the front door of that house? Who tied the ribbons in that little girl's braids? What book had been left open on the garden bench before the rain came? One afternoon, she walked to the market and found herself drawn to a fruit she hadn't tasted in decades. Figs, ripened just past their prime, soft to the touch and bleeding sweetness. She brought them home, sliced one open, and paused. A scent rose, not of the present, but of a kitchen somewhere else where a hand, thin, deliberate, drizzled honey over halves of figs in a chipped ceramic bowl. There was a window open, curtains fluttering, a cat on the ledge. She tasted the fruit and felt tears sting her eyes, not from sadness but from arrival. She had never been there, and yet she was home. That evening she placed the teacup in a new spot, on her nightstand. Not out of fear it might leave, but in recognition that it had already stayed longer than it needed to. It had shared what it carried, and now it simply rested. She began to whisper thank you to no one in particular. It wasn't a prayer, not exactly. Just a quiet acknowledgement, uttered when she brushed her fingers across the rim of the cup, or when the light struck the wooden floor in a way that reminded her of something she could almost remember. It became a habit, a rhythm. Sometimes she would catch herself whispering it aloud while making tea or folding towels, and she would smile, not embarrassed, but softened. Gratitude, she found, didn't require understanding, only presence. The memories changed after that. They grew less polished, less like scenes and more like fragments. A cough behind a closed door, a child's coat with a missing button, an ink stain on a letter never mailed. These pieces didn't assemble into narrative. They floated, weightless and incomplete, but each carried a temperature, a pulse. She didn't try to make sense of them. Meaning, she had come to realize, wasn't in the order. It was in the intimacy of being allowed to feel what someone else once felt, of standing barefoot in the traces left behind by an unseen life and not demanding answers. She dreamt of the sea one night. Not a grand, cinematic sea, but a quiet cove lined with dark rocks and trembling reeds. In the dream, the woman stood at the edge, holding the teacup, its surface catching the moonlight like a mirror. She didn't pour it out. She didn't drink. She only held it close as though listening. And in that moment, the sea didn't crash or call. It breathed, a long, low exhale that moved across water and skin and memory, as if the entire world had been holding something in, and was finally ready to let it go. When she woke, her room was still. The cup sat where she had left it, but for the first time, it looked like just a cup. No shimmer, no hum, just porcelain and curve and glaze. She stared at it, not with disappointment, but with a strange affection, like one feels toward a letter already read, a song whose lyrics no longer sting. She picked it up, turned it slowly in her hand, and smiled, not because the memory had ended, but because it had found its place, inside her, alongside her own. She placed the cup in the cabinet once more, not hidden, but not waiting. It would be there if needed. But she no longer sat beside it each afternoon. She had planted violets in the garden, hung a new set of curtains, left the back door open long enough for the wind to enter without knocking. The memories still came, now and then, but gently, like visitors who no longer needed to be heard, only remembered. And she remembered, not as an outsider, but as someone who had been trusted with a story, not to keep, just to carry a while. It took her some time to notice the absence. The quiet that followed was not emptiness, but something more subtle, a pause that lingered just beyond reach. Days passed without a memory, no flicker of someone else's past, no sudden warmth at the handle of the cup. Just ordinary moments, toast and jam, the hum of the refrigerator, the rustle of newspaper pages she barely skimmed. It wasn't that she missed the memories. It was that she had grown used to being accompanied, even by someone unknown. She found herself walking more. Not for exercise, not to fill the hours, but because the streets began to feel less fixed. Trees she had passed for years looked newly planted. Sidewalk cracks curved differently. Windows displayed items she could have sworn weren't there before. She didn't feel lost, only loosened, as though the world had shifted slightly on its axis, and she had simply failed to notice until now. In the market, she stood too long before the tea aisle, staring at the labels. She chose a blend she'd never tried, with dried marigold petals and anise. It tasted like nothing familiar. She drank it anyway. The cup remained on the shelf, untouched, not because she feared it, but because she no longer felt summoned. Whatever had needed her seemed to have passed through, a tide that had reached its furthest pull, now retreating quietly. And yet, even in this absence, she felt its echo. She found herself tracing the shape of certain objects, lingering over the rim of a glass, brushing the spine of a book without opening it. There were gestures that weren't hers, but had become hers. The line between borrowing and becoming had vanished. One morning, she opened the drawer beside her bed and found the old notepad where she had once scribbled fragments, names, places, phrases without context. She flipped through the pages, expecting them to feel distant, like postcards from a trip she hadn't taken. But instead, each word pulsed with recognition. Not nostalgia, not mystery, just a quiet belonging. These were not clues. They were imprints. And though she couldn't place everyone, she didn't need to anymore. She had carried them long enough that they no longer asked for identification. They asked only to be remembered. Later that day, she took the cup from the shelf. No ceremony, no breath held. She simply rinsed it, dried it, and set it beside her new tea. The handle was cool, the porcelain silent. And when she held it to her lips, there was no vision, no garden, no piano, no blue door, only the taste of marigold and anise and morning light. It wasn't disappointing. It was grounding, as if the life that had passed through her had finally let go, so she could begin living her own. She didn't speak of it, even to herself. Whatever had passed between her and the memories felt too delicate for words, too sacred for the clumsiness of explanation. And yet it lingered, in her footsteps, in the way her hand paused over a cupboard, in the attention she gave to small things, the sound of water filling a pot, the feel of linen smoothed flat against a bed. These actions had become slower, more deliberate, as if she were still moving within someone else's tempo, or perhaps simply honoring it. She started writing letters again, not to send, not to anyone she knew, just lines on paper addressed to you. She never clarified who you was. Sometimes the letters were full of questions. Did you ever return to that garden? Was the blue door locked for long? Other times they were just descriptions of her day, her meals, the weather. She wrote as if someone might be reading, but never expected a reply. There was comfort in that, a kind of companionship that didn't demand closeness. The act of writing was enough. It gave shape to the in-between. One evening, while sorting through a box of old photographs, her own this time, she found an image she didn't remember taking. A table, a teacup, a woman's hands, blurred just slightly, resting beside a plate of sliced figs. It was not the same cup, not the same table, but something in the posture, in the light falling across the hands, made her breath catch. She turned the photo over. No date, no name. Just the faint outline of a fingerprint pressed into the corner, where it must have been held many times. She didn't put it away. She placed it on the fridge with a weak magnet and let it watch over her morning toast. She realized something then. Not all memories needed to belong to someone. Some simply existed, untethered, drifting, waiting for a place to land. And perhaps the cup had carried not a person's past, but memory itself, orphaned and patient. It had not asked to be understood. It had only asked to be held. And she had done that, carefully, quietly, as best she could. Maybe that was all memory ever needed, a witness. That night, before bed, She stood at the window longer than usual. The street was quiet. A porch light flickered 2 houses down. Somewhere in the distance, a wind chime stirred, soft and half-hearted. She pressed her hand to the glass, not for warmth, but to feel the cool, to remember that she was still here, in her own life now, not haunted, not hollow, simply changed. The photo on the fridge began to curl slightly at the edges. Each morning, as she passed it to retrieve milk or jam, she would smooth it gently with her fingertips, as though pressing it back into place might also press the moment back into memory. She didn't know who had taken it, or how it had ended up in her box, but she no longer questioned it. Some objects simply arrive, like seeds carried by the wind, meant to root, meant to bloom, even if not where they were first planted. She began setting the table for 2. There was no expectation behind it, no fantasy. She didn't cook more food or light extra candles. She simply placed a second cup, sometimes hers, sometimes one borrowed from the back of the cabinet, on the other side of the table. She didn't speak to it. She didn't name it. But the gesture made the mornings feel rounder, as if silence could sit across from her without feeling so still. She would eat slowly, pausing between bites, listening to the tick of the kitchen clock. The second cup never moved, never cooled. It just stayed, a quiet placeholder for a presence she didn't need to define. Her neighbors had begun to wave more often, not out of friendliness, necessarily, but out of recognition. She had become one of the steady ones, the woman who watered her plants at the same hour, who walked without headphones, who sat on her porch long enough to notice birds returning to the same branch. It wasn't connection. Not quite, but it was visibility, a soft anchoring to the world around her after so long of floating between here and elsewhere. Sometimes the memories still stirred, not as full visions but as tugs, sensory threads that pulled her backward without warning. The feel of lace under her palms, the sound of rain on a tin roof, the metallic taste of a penny placed on the tongue during childhood games. She didn't know which were hers anymore, and she had stopped needing to. The line between inheritance and experience had blurred beyond recovery. But rather than feeling lost, she felt expanded, as if her soul had borrowed a little more space in the world, not to fill it, but to carry it. One night, she dreamed of the woman again, not in the garden this time, but in a hallway, lit only by candlelight. She was older now, hair streaked with silver, hands wrapped around a book she didn't open. They didn't speak. They never did. But their eyes met, and there was something passed between them. Not knowledge, not closure, just understanding. As if both had come to accept that some lives are shared not by blood or time, but by memory. She found herself touching fabrics differently, lingering over textures, tracing the seams of blouses she hadn't worn in years, pressing her cheek to folded quilts as though scent and softness could answer questions. Her hands had changed, not in appearance, but in intention. They no longer reached for things automatically. They approached slowly, curiously, like guests knocking before entering. Each object seemed to hold a possibility now. Not magic, not mystery, just the faint suggestion of memory. Not what it contained, but what it remembered being near. One afternoon, while dusting the top shelf of a cabinet, she discovered an old wooden box she couldn't recall placing there. It wasn't hidden, just forgotten, or perhaps waiting. Inside were postcards, faded, unsent, their edges browned with age. Each one had a place she had never visited but somehow recognized: a lighthouse, a bridge, a fountain beside a stone lion with moss between its paws. None had messages, just the printed names of cities that stirred something behind her ribs, not longing, but familiarity. She closed the box and kept it near her reading chair, like a book that had never been written but knew how to be read. There were days when the house felt too quiet, not lonely, not haunting, just still. She would play old records, not for the music, but for the crackle between the notes. That in-between sound soothed her in ways conversation never had. Sometimes she danced, barely more than a sway, a shifting of weight between heel and toe. Her body remembered how to move without reason, just because the afternoon lights slanted in at the right angle, just because the wind outside rattled something loose in the screen door, just because she could. She kept the teacup in the kitchen now, not as an altar, not as a relic, just as a cup. Sometimes she used it, sometimes not, but it no longer pulsed with the weight of someone else's life. It had been emptied, not in loss, but in offering. What it had given her was not a past to own, but a presence to grow into. It had taught her to listen, not to voices, but to quiet, to feel the shape of things without demanding names. And in that learning, she had softened. The garden had begun to change too, slowly, without permission. A wild vine she hadn't planted crawled along the fence. A small patch of mint burst through where she thought nothing would grow. She let it be. Some things arrived without cause. Some roots don't ask first, and she had learned to say yes to what came gently, even if it came from somewhere far older than her own beginning. She began painting again, not with ambition, not with skill, but with a kind of quiet apology to time. Her brushes were stiff with disuse, her paints half dried in their tins. Yet when she dipped one into water and pressed it against paper, the color moved as though it had been waiting. She didn't paint people, or places, just impressions. A line that might become a hill, a curve that hinted at a shoulder, a blue that belonged to no particular sky. The images never resolved themselves fully, but that wasn't the point. The act of making was enough. The silence between strokes was part of the language. One morning, as she was rinsing out a brush, she heard the cup rattle gently on the shelf. It hadn't been touched. There was no breeze, no tremor in the house. Just a small sound, like acknowledgement. She turned to look at it. Nothing had changed. And yet she felt seen, as if something long departed had nodded once before leaving for good. She smiled, not because it was over, but because it had never needed to last. The memory had done its work. And now, so would she. She wrote one final letter. This time, she signed it. Not with her full name, just her first. As if that was enough. As if anyone who needed to know the rest already did. She folded it slowly, placed it in the drawer beside the bed, and left it unopened. It wasn't meant to be sent. It was meant to be kept. Some words, like some lives, are meant only for the one who lived them, and the one who listened. Later that week, she invited a neighbor for tea. A quiet woman, slightly younger, with kind eyes and too many grocery bags. They sat on the porch, speaking little, sipping slowly. She used 2 different cups, not the one. That one stayed inside now, resting, honored, but no longer needed. The conversation drifted between herbs and weather, and which part of the garden held shade longest in the afternoon. It was the most ordinary visit, and yet, as the sun lowered and the light softened, she felt a fullness in her chest. Not joy, not pride, just presence. A feeling that something had closed gently around her, like hands folding a blanket at the end of day. That night she left the window cracked open, not for a breeze, but for memory itself, should it wish to return not as a guide, not as a guest, but simply as a friend. She had lived in the house for nearly 3 decades, but it was only now that she began to wonder what stories had come before her. Not in the paperwork sense. She had read the deed, knew the names etched in formal records. No, this wondering was quieter, more intuitive. A sense that each creak in the floorboards might be a sentence from an older conversation. That the faint smell behind the hallway radiator wasn't dust, but memory, folded in like lavender between linen sheets. The house had always been kind to her. No burst pipes, no sudden mold, no invasions of ants or mice. It held its age with grace. But now, walking through it in the hush of late afternoon, She began to notice things she hadn't before. A patch of faded wallpaper behind a bookcase. A nail in the wall where no painting had ever hung during her time. The faintest outline of something once leaned against the baseboard in the back bedroom. A trunk? A crib? She didn't know. But the impressions remained, like footprints in soil long since hardened. She stopped moving furniture. Not because she feared disturbing something, but because the placement now felt intentional, even if it hadn't been. The armchair by the window belonged there, not only to her, but to someone before. The small crack in the tile by the kitchen sink drew her eye more often. It curved slightly to the left like a hairline fracture in time. She began tracing it absently with her toe while washing dishes. It felt like she was stepping into someone else's rhythm. A woman who had stood here once, sleeves rolled up, humming something forgotten. She could almost hear the breath behind the melody. On quiet evenings, she would sit in the hallway with a cup of tea, never the same blend twice, and simply listen, not for voices, not for ghosts, but for texture. The grain of silence in a house that had absorbed generations. Sometimes it felt thicker near the closet with the sticky door. Other times it gathered in corners she never swept. The house wasn't haunted. It was inhabited. By echoes. By repetitions. By the gentleness of lives that had passed through without needing to be recorded. One day, while dusting the windowsill in the back bedroom, she found a faint inscription carved into the wood, barely visible unless the sun hit it just right. 3 letters. Possibly a name. Possibly initials. She didn't trace them. She didn't take a picture. She simply stood there, tea cooling in her hand, and whispered a greeting she didn't know how to finish. The house answered by doing what it had always done best, holding still and remembering. She started leaving doors open, not wide, just slightly ajar. Enough for air to pass through, enough for light to spill unevenly from one room into another. She didn't know why exactly, only that it felt wrong now to close anything completely. The house had become a map of passageways, not separation. A quiet invitation extended not to people, but to presence. As if somewhere in the spaces between walls, someone, or something, might still be walking, not watching, not waiting, just walking, as if it had always done so, long before she arrived. In the front room, the floor had begun to creak in a familiar pattern. 3 slow steps, then pause. She didn't flinch when she heard it anymore. It was always the same, always at dusk, always just as she was setting her cup down. It might have been the wind, or the settling of old beams, or the rhythm of her own memory echoing back at her. She never tried to explain it. The house didn't ask for logic. It asked for awareness, for stillness, and so she gave it. She moved a chair into the hallway, not for sitting, but for acknowledgement. It faced a blank wall, under a narrow window that offered more shadow than light. She had passed that spot for years without noticing its shape, but now it felt like a place where someone had once waited, or returned to, or needed to pause before opening a door. She draped a shawl across the chair's back, not hers, not worn in years, but still carrying the faintest trace of lavender. She never touched it again. It didn't belong to her anymore. One night, she dreamt of a door that didn't exist. Not in her house, not in any house she remembered. It was green, like the garden memory, but wider, with brass studs and a heavy ring handle that swung without sound. In the dream, she didn't open it. She simply stood before it, hand hovering near the latch, knowing that what lay beyond wasn't frightening, just not hers. She woke with the shape of it still behind her eyes, a door not to be entered but understood. A symbol, perhaps, or a memory someone else had left behind, hoping she would find it. She spent more time by the windows now, watching, not for visitors, but for shifts. The way the sky changed hue just before rain. The moment birds stopped singing, and then began again. The tiny difference between silence that waits and silence that rests. Her own life had become less defined by dates or tasks. It was shaped instead by atmospheres, by the temperature of rooms, by the way the house breathed when she was paying attention, and even more when she wasn't. She had never thought of the walls as listeners, But now when she leaned her back against the cool plaster in the narrow hallway, she sometimes imagined it listening, not in a curious or judging way, but with the quiet patience of something that had heard everything before. Arguments muffled by time, laughter that rose and fell too fast, the whisper of footsteps retreating after midnight, the scrape of furniture dragged into new positions that never felt quite right. The walls didn't repeat, they didn't remind, they just held it all, layer upon layer, like sediment of emotion compacted into stillness. She began writing notes and tucking them into corners of the house, under the kitchen sink, inside a drawer in the linen cupboard, beneath the cushion of the hallway chair. Small pieces of paper folded twice, sometimes blank, sometimes with only a word. Stay, still, yes. She didn't know who they were for, not for herself, not for anyone likely to find them. But the act of placing them felt right, like laying stones along a path that no longer needed to lead anywhere, only mark that someone had passed through gently. Her nights grew lighter, not happier, not freer, just softer. She no longer waited for dreams to arrive with meaning. She let them drift through, like fog on a quiet lake. Sometimes she saw the woman again, not always clearly, and not always alone. Once the woman stood at a window identical to her own, but looked out onto a world made entirely of twilight. Another time, there was a child sleeping in her lap, though no names were spoken. The dreams never gave her anything to keep, only moments to witness, and she welcomed them, not as interruptions, but as returns. One morning she heard music in the house, just a few notes, a low hum, like a cello tuned by memory rather than string. She walked from room to room slowly, knowing there was no source. It wasn't coming from a speaker or a neighbor's window. It was inside the space itself, like breath caught in old wood. The sound didn't continue, but something had shifted. She stood in the front room with her hand on the doorway and felt, gently, deeply, unalone. The house had not changed, not visibly, but it had accepted her in a new way, as if it had finally finished asking, "Who are you?" and begun answering, "You are here." And that was enough. Not a welcome, not a farewell, just recognition, between inhabitant and space, between now and then. She began to move differently through the house, not faster, not slower, but with a kind of grace that hadn't been there before. Her feet knew where to step without creaking the floor. Her hands reached for switches before the light was needed. She found herself pausing in doorways without planning to, as though her body remembered another presence passing through before her. It wasn't mimicry. It wasn't performance. It was alignment. She was no longer the only rhythm in the house, and somehow she was no longer out of tune. The objects within the rooms began to hold meaning, not through use, but through atmosphere. A vase with no flowers, positioned just slightly off-center on a windowsill, now looked exactly right. A drawer that stuck halfway open had become a trusted signal. The weather was shifting again. The wind had curled differently through the eaves. She didn't fix it. She didn't shift anything back into order. The house didn't want order. It wanted memory. And memory was always a little crooked. Sometimes she sat with her back against the wall in the smallest room, the one no guest ever entered. She brought no book, no tea, just stillness. It was a place with no stories attached to her life, no birthdays, no illness, no decorations ever hung, but she could feel its use, past or future, she wasn't sure, a waiting room for memory itself. She placed her palms flat on the floor and breathed, not in search of anything, just in response. And sometimes in that silence, she felt a twinge behind her ribs like the echo of someone else's longing. Released, at last, she began to hum, not always out loud, often just in her throat, a vibration more than a sound. She didn't recognize the melody. It had no pattern, but it seemed to please the air, as if the walls leaned in to listen, as if the corners of the room curved subtly inward, gentler than before. Once, as she was humming while cleaning the window ledge, a small gust of wind pushed the curtain forward just enough to touch her cheek. It felt like an answer. She didn't flinch. She whispered a wordless acknowledgement and kept humming. The house had given her no secrets, no revelations, no answers to the question of whose memories had poured through the porcelain. But in return for her listening, it had offered her something stranger and deeper: coexistence. A way of being that didn't require proof, a peace that didn't need explanation, and she, in turn, had stopped needing anything to resolve. She had learned to rest in the space between histories, where her breath could mix with all the breaths that came before. She had started to think of the house not as hers, but as a place she was in conversation with. It didn't require ownership. It responded only to presence. The walls did not answer questions, but they offered quiet. The floors didn't lead, only followed. And the ceilings, once so high and cold, had softened somehow, like old hands that no longer clenched. She walked through the rooms as though revisiting a familiar book, not to reread, but to remember how it felt the first time she didn't know what would come next. On a morning shaped like any other, she opened the cupboard for the teacup. Not out of ritual, not out of need, only instinct. But the shelf where it had always been resting was empty. She paused, unsure whether her memory had erred, or if she had moved it absent-mindedly. She searched the dish rack, the sink, the table. Nothing. No crash had woken her. No one had entered. And yet the cup was gone. Her breath didn't quicken. There was no panic. Only a pause, deeper than the kind that comes before fear. She stood still in the center of the kitchen, her hand resting on the countertop, and listened, not for sound, but for meaning. And what she felt was not loss, not confusion, just permission. It had left, whether it had shattered silently, or returned to where it came from, or dissolved into the air after finishing its work. She didn't know. And she didn't need to. The cup had been a threshold, and thresholds are not meant to be permanent. They are meant to be crossed. She brewed tea anyway, in a plain mug. No crackling warmth, no visions, no memories that didn't belong to her. She sat in the chair by the window and drank it slowly. The light that morning was especially soft, filtering through clouds that didn't seem entirely real. Outside, a bird landed on the railing, glanced once in her direction, and then flew off. She watched until it vanished beyond the fence. Later that day, she placed a small note under the floorboard that creaked beneath the front door. She didn't write a message, just drew a circle with a single line running through it. She folded it once, pressed it flat, and slid it into the dark. It felt like punctuation, not an ending, just a mark that something had happened here. Something had passed through, and someone had listened. The house exhaled around her, not louder, not brighter, not fuller, just clearer, like a room that had been rearranged in the dark and only now, in daylight, made perfect sense. There are things we carry that never belong to us, not burdens, not gifts, something in between. She had learned this slowly, the way a body adjusts to a new rhythm without knowing it's changed. The teacup had vanished, but the imprint of its presence remained, not in the room, but in her. She found herself reaching for silence more often now, not as escape, but as conversation. The kind of silence that comes after something meaningful leaves and doesn't need to return to be real. She began walking without destination, not far, just out the door, around the corner, past the same hedges and fences she'd passed for years. But now, each step felt layered, like the ground remembered every footfall it had ever received, and welcomed hers among them. She passed mailboxes that leaned slightly to one side, heard dogs bark from behind curtains that never moved. Sometimes she waved to no one, not because she mistook a shape for a person, but because the gesture itself felt necessary, a way of saying, "I see what was once here." At home, she opened drawers and cabinets slowly, not to search for anything, but to notice the rust on the hinge, the way the shadow fell over a folded towel, the crease in the corner of a page in a book she didn't remember reading, but whose words felt worn in all the right places. She had stopped expecting to know what was hers and what wasn't. Ownership no longer mattered. She lived among borrowed textures now, things left behind not to be claimed, but to be honored. She started lighting a candle each evening, even when the room was already bright. It was never scented, never ceremonial, just one small flicker to acknowledge transition, a signal to the house, to herself, to the day that had passed without fanfare but not without weight. Sometimes she would cup her hand around the flame and let the warmth linger against her palm, not to draw anything out, just to be reminded that warmth, like memory, doesn't need permanence to be felt deeply. And in the stillness between candlelight and nightfall, she would think, not of the woman in the memories, not of the garden, or the hallway, or the piano, but of what it meant to carry something through without asking where it came from. She hadn't inherited a life. She hadn't dreamed someone else's past. She had kept something, without keeping it. And that, she was starting to realize, was its own kind of love. She began tending the garden again, though not with the urgency of someone hoping to transform it. There was no grand plan, no symmetry, just hands in soil and time allowed to pass unmeasured. She planted things she couldn't name, bought from a roadside stand where the labels had faded, and the woman behind the table smiled like she knew something words couldn't hold. Some of the plants bloomed, others didn't. But each morning, she stepped out barefoot onto the porch to see what had changed or what had stayed the same, and both felt like a form of arrival. In the corner of the yard, she placed a chipped saucer she found behind the shed. It didn't match anything. Not her old dishes. Not the cup that had disappeared. But when the sun hit it in the late afternoon, it glowed. Not brightly, just enough to be noticed. She left it there without reason, or rather, without needing one. Sometimes a space asks for something small, a marker, a whisper to time that says, "I was here, and I saw you." She never told anyone about the saucer, not because it was secret, but because it didn't need to be spoken to exist. Inside the house, her movements became softer. Not slower, just quieter, as though she were living alongside something rather than within it. She closed doors gently, picked up books with both hands, folded blankets with the care of someone handling pages from an old diary. Nothing demanded reverence, but everything received it. Even the kettle received a moment of stillness before being set to boil. Even the stairs, once groaning and impatient, seemed to ease under her weight now, as if they too had settled into the presence of someone who listened. She stopped correcting her memories. If she recalled a detail wrong, a shirt the wrong color, a song in the wrong room, she let it be. She had come to understand that the point wasn't accuracy, it was attention. And attention was a form of devotion. It was what had allowed her to hold someone else's memory for so long. Not perfectly, not forever, but fully while it lasted. And now, in her own memories, there were moments shaped not by fact but by feeling. A garden that may have never existed. A voice she never heard but could still describe. At night, she often found herself awake without restlessness. The dark didn't press against her anymore. It surrounded her like a coat woven from every silence she had ever worn. She would lie still and imagine the cup, not to summon it, not to wish it back, but to remember the exact weight of it in her hand, not heavy, not light, just enough to remind her that sometimes the most precious things are not the ones we keep, but the ones we're trusted to hold for a little while. She began to notice how people spoke of forgetting as if it were always a loss, as if memory were something to hoard, to guard, to preserve at all costs. But her days had taught her something gentler, that forgetting, too, could be an act of grace. Letting go of details that had outlived their meaning, releasing moments that had settled too deeply into the cracks, not erasing them, but loosening their grip, letting them float instead of settle, drift instead of define. There were mornings when she would hold her cup, an ordinary one now, no story carved into its shape, and forget just for a second which side of the window she was on, whether she was the one remembering or the one being remembered. The sensation didn't frighten her. It felt like standing between mirrors and catching the shimmer of yourself. Not in reflection, but an echo, like walking through a hallway and sensing that someone had just left, and left the door open behind them so you could see the shape of where they had been. She started writing again. Not letters, not journals, just fragments. Phrases that came to her while steeping tea, or while watching the rain collect in the grooves of the patio. Things like, "The light doesn't apologize when it returns," or "She never closed the gate because someone might come home." She didn't organize them, didn't seek coherence. She let them gather the way dust gathers on beloved shelves, not clutter, but presence, the slow, honest mark of time. One phrase returned often, in slightly different forms. What was never mine but stayed with me anyway. She wrote it in the margins of books, on scraps tucked into coat pockets, once even on the inside of a grocery list. It followed her not as a question, but as a shape her life had begun to take. She had not owned the memories, had not asked for them, but she had carried them with reverence. And now that they were gone, or quiet, she carried something else. A stillness that hummed beneath everything. Sometimes, in the late hours when the world thinned and time felt soft, she imagined the cup again, not in her hand, but in someone else's, perhaps far away, perhaps in another house like hers, where someone sat in an old chair and felt something stir as porcelain warmed. Maybe they, too, didn't know why they had reached for that cup. Maybe they, too, were remembering someone they never met. And maybe, just maybe, memory had found its next place to rest, and had gone on ahead without saying goodbye. There are moments when something inside the room shifts, but nothing has moved. She had come to recognize that sensation, not as discomfort, not as mystery, but as a quiet invitation. The space had memory, even without the cup. The air held its own weight, and sometimes, when she turned a page or refilled the kettle, she would feel it settle on her shoulders like an old shawl, threadbare, familiar, never entirely hers. She wore it anyway. It fit better now. The house remained unchanged in all the usual ways. The same hum of the refrigerator, the same slightly off-center rug, the same squeak in the hallway floor that could never be fixed, only respected. But within these constants, she felt a presence that had stopped being separate from her. It didn't linger like a visitor. It lived like breath, not always noticed, but always moving through her. She had stopped trying to separate what belonged to her and what didn't. She simply cared for all of it, as if it had always been hers to keep safe, even if only temporarily. One morning, she sat at the kitchen table and traced circles on the surface with the edge of her mug. Steam curled upward, caught the light, vanished. She thought about how memory behaved the same way, rising, catching, disappearing, not gone, but no longer seen. She didn't reach for anything, not paper, not pen, just the moment, the warmth beneath her hand, the sunlight angling through the glass, the stillness that didn't ask for her to do anything but witness it. She had once feared fading, the idea that her life might slip into irrelevance, that her name would someday be spoken with a shrug, or not at all. But now, that fear had thinned, because she had held something she couldn't name, and it had changed her. And that change, however small, would outlive her, in how she moved through rooms, in how she folded blankets, in how she looked at objects no one else noticed. Even in silence, she had left something behind, and whatever came next would know, in some quiet way, that someone had loved the world this gently. That afternoon, as she washed the few dishes from lunch, she looked at her reflection in the window, not to study it, but to greet it. She looked older than she remembered, softer around the mouth, more space in the eyes. Not sadness, not tiredness, just space. Room enough for things that weren't hers, but had chosen to rest with her for a time. She smiled, not because she felt joyful, but because she understood now that even a borrowed memory could leave behind something real, if you let it stay long enough to soften the edges. She didn't mark the anniversary. There was no date to circle, no event to recall. Only the subtle knowing that time had passed, enough time for something to settle, to root, to become part of her without needing to be named again. The absence of the cup was no longer a gap, but a thread woven into everything else. in the way she rinsed her dishes, in how she paused before stepping through thresholds, in how she now held quiet not as an emptiness, but as a companion. The house had grown quieter with her, not silent, just more attuned. It no longer creaked in confusion. The floorboards beneath her feet sounded more like agreement than resistance. Light pooled longer in the corners of rooms that once felt restless. Even the shadows had softened, their edges no longer reaching, but resting. She sometimes caught herself speaking aloud, not to anyone, not even to memory, but to the air itself. A sentence left unfinished, a thought offered gently, and the air, as always, listened. On one of those quiet evenings, she stepped into the garden barefoot. The grass had grown uneven. A few weeds had reclaimed their place. The saucer in the far corner had collected rainwater and tiny leaves. She knelt beside it, ran her finger along its rim, and smiled, not at the object, not at any memory it stirred, but at the small, sacred absurdity of how something so ordinary had held space for something so profound. She didn't clean it. She didn't move it. She simply stood again, letting her toes sink into the soil, and whispered a thank you that no one heard, but everything received. Inside, she poured herself tea in her plain mug and sat by the window as dusk curled into the room. She watched the light dim slowly, watched the outline of her hands grow softer against the cup. And for a moment, it didn't matter whether the memory had ever belonged to her. It had lived. It had breathed. It had shaped her hands and her stillness, and the way she now touched the world. And maybe that was the quiet miracle of it all. Not that she had seen through another's eyes, but that she had learned how to keep the tenderness it left behind. She would never explain this, not because it was secret, but because it didn't require telling. Some truths grow best in silence, in tea left warm, in chairs placed near windows, in footsteps that hesitate not from doubt, but from reverence. She had held what was never hers, and now it had become part of everything she gave. She never told anyone the full story, not because it was too strange, but because it was too still. Some experiences resist translation. They live not in the words we choose, but in the way we pause before speaking, in the way we place our hand on the back of a chair before sitting, in how we fold a napkin with unnecessary care. These are the details that carry weight, not because they are dramatic, but because they are remembered by the body before the mind knows why. She had grown accustomed to being changed in small, imperceptible ways. The way her shoulders now relaxed when entering a room, the way she looked at things before picking them up, as if asking permission, the way she listened longer before responding to even the smallest sound, water boiling, leaves brushing the window, her own breath adjusting to a shift in light. The world hadn't slowed down. She had. And in doing so, she had begun to feel the spaces between moments, those quiet seams where memory, if given room, might settle in and stay. She had never gone looking for the cup again. Not in thrift shops, not online, not even in memory. She let it go without needing to let it disappear. Some things, once lived through, no longer need a symbol. They echo instead in gesture, in ritual, in the angle of a hand holding something fragile, even if it's only a folded towel. She had become that echo, and oddly, it comforted her to know that she would carry it, not as a possession, but as a rhythm, into places far from where it began. One afternoon, while walking through the older part of town, she passed a small window display of second-hand porcelain. No cup caught her eye. Nothing shimmered. Nothing pulsed. And yet, she paused, because for a brief moment, she felt it again, that soft thrum in the air, like a thread tugging gently at the edge of presence, not calling her back, but walking beside her. She kept walking, not because the feeling faded, but because it had finally become part of her gait. And as the sun dipped behind the rooftops and the streetlights blinked on one by one, she realized something she hadn't before. Not all memory waits to be found. Some memory follows, quietly, lovingly, without needing to announce itself. And this one, whatever it had been, whoever it had belonged to, was no longer something she had held. It was something that now walked with her. She began to feel most herself in moments when no one was watching, when the curtain swayed slightly and the room filled with that particular kind of dusk, the one that blurs the boundary between light and shadow. When her hand brushed the edge of a shelf, or her shoulder touched the doorway she passed through a dozen times a day. These small touches, unspoken and unseen, had become her language. She didn't need to name what they meant. She only needed to feel their weight in silence. Her days no longer asked for story. They asked for texture, the coolness of the floor under bare feet, the uneven edge of a wooden spoon worn smooth by years of stirring, the hollow knock of her knuckle on the pantry door, out of habit rather than reason. She had stopped trying to understand why certain gestures remained. She simply followed them, let them guide her like old songs whose lyrics she no longer recalled, but whose melody lived somewhere behind her ribs. One morning she found a pale blue thread on the windowsill. Not long, frayed slightly at both ends. It caught the light in a way that made her pause. She hadn't sewn in years, hadn't kept anything of that color in recent memory. But the thread felt like a remnant of something, not from the cup, not from the house, but from the space between them. She placed it gently into the inside pocket of her coat without questioning why. And each time her fingers brushed against it afterward, she felt less alone in the world. She began walking farther, through unfamiliar streets, past fences lined with ivy and garages painted in fading colors. She didn't look for meaning in the houses she passed, but sometimes when she glimpsed a curtain drawn just so, or a porch light left on in the middle of the afternoon, she imagined someone inside, also holding something quiet, not heavy, just unexplainable. She wondered how many of them had carried a memory that didn't belong to them, but changed them anyway. How many had felt their lives tilt slightly, without knowing what had caused the shift. At home, she moved with a softness that required no effort. She no longer separated her days into chapters. She let them run together like watercolor left to soak into paper. Some mornings arrived with fog, others with the scent of something forgotten. She welcomed both. For she knew now that the memory she had once tried to understand had never wanted to be solved. It had only wanted to be kept, gently, without question, the way one holds a bird too tired to fly but not yet ready to leave. The rooms began to feel less like rooms and more like thresholds, not to other places but to other versions of herself, softer ones, quieter ones, pieces that had waited patiently to be lived. She no longer filled silence with anything. No radio in the background, no television murmuring through empty afternoons. Just the layered hush of her own presence becoming whole. Even the ticking of the clock had softened, as if time itself had taken a step back to listen. She spent more time near the front window now, not because anything happened there. The street was quiet, the trees rarely moved, and the occasional passerby never looked up. But she liked the way light pooled on the sill. Some days she placed a single object there, an old key, a polished stone, a folded note never opened. She didn't arrange them. She didn't explain them. She just let them catch the sun one at a time. It felt like offering something back, a quiet exchange, a reply, long overdue. There were moments when memory returned, not in scenes or sensations, but in posture. The way her hand hovered before lifting a cup, the way her feet avoided a floorboard that never squeaked. She didn't question whether the memory belonged to her or not. That distinction no longer mattered. It had moved in, like breath, and in its presence she had found a rhythm more honest than anything she had ever been taught. Not structured, not poetic, just real. One evening, as shadows stretched long across the room, she stood in the hallway and touched the wall with her open palm. The paint was cool, the grain of the plaster rough in places. She closed her eyes and breathed, not deeply, not deliberately, just enough to know she was there. And in that quiet pause, she felt the faintest impression of a hand pressed beside hers. Not a vision, not a ghost, just a shape the wall seemed to remember and offer. She stayed like that for some time, her fingers not gripping, just resting. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply was, alongside whatever had chosen to remain. And when she finally stepped away, she didn't look back to see if the impression lingered. She didn't need to. She had come to understand that some memory doesn't leave marks in walls or names in books. Some memory walks with us, quietly enough that we forget it's there, until we realize how gently it has shaped the way we move through the world. She stopped needing to mark the days. Calendars no longer held significance. Seasons spoke for themselves, in how the light shifted on the walls, how the trees whispered different stories, how the wind became more or less forgiving. She moved with these changes instinctively, like a tide that no longer checked the moon before deciding how far to reach. Her life wasn't smaller than before. It was quieter. And in that quiet, there was room for everything that didn't need to be said. Objects began to find their own places again, not where logic dictated, but where they seemed to rest most easily. A wooden spoon beside the sink, even though she no longer cooked much. A feather on the mantel, its source unknown. A tiny glass bottle near the entryway, catching morning light like it had waited its whole life to do just that. She no longer felt the need to explain their presence. Some things belong because they're still here, and some are still here because someone once cared enough not to move them. She started to forget names, but not feelings. Not because her memory was failing. She could still recall addresses, phone numbers, the exact year the floor was refinished. But names became less useful than tone, less lasting than the warmth behind a gaze or the hush between sentences. She remembered people by how they made her hands still or restless, by whether they filled the room with volume or left behind a shape more like music. It was enough. Sometimes it was more than enough. At dusk, she often sat near the back door, which she now left slightly open. The air moved in slow and tentative, as if unsure whether it was welcome. She never rushed it. She simply waited, allowed it to find its way. And when it did, when the room cooled just slightly and the curtains shifted with breath, she would close her eyes, not to sleep, but to feel the way the house exhaled. It was a soundless gesture, a signal that something had stayed, not to haunt, not to teach, but simply to be near. And in those moments, between the wind and the window, between tea cooling and night arriving, she understood something final, though not in words. The memory that had walked with her, the presence she had once tried to define, had never asked her to become anything, only to stay open, to keep space, to move slowly enough that something ancient and fleeting could find her and linger without fear of being erased. In the end, there was no revelation, no grand unveiling of meaning, just the quiet, continuous folding of days into each other like sheets washed smooth by time. She no longer asked what any of it had been for. She simply lived with it, as one lives with the scent of lavender in an old drawer, faint, persistent, and unexpectedly tender. She still brewed tea, still used the same plain mug, still sat in the same chair by the window, where the light came in softer than anywhere else in the house. The room no longer felt like a place where something had happened. It felt like a place where something had been allowed, a room that had witnessed gentleness, and in that it had changed, just as she had. The garden bloomed unevenly that spring. A few violets in places she hadn't planted. A crooked sprout of mint in the shadow of a fence. She left them untouched. Let them grow wild and unsupervised. She didn't need them to be beautiful. She only needed them to continue, to exist, to return year after year as proof that presence does not require permanence, that some things return not because they are remembered, but because they were welcomed. One afternoon, a bird she had never seen before landed on the railing and tilted its head toward her, holding still for far longer than birds tend to. She didn't move, she didn't speak, she simply looked back, and in that silent exchange, something passed between them. Not message, not metaphor, just awareness. Two living things recognizing each other without needing to explain how or why. That night, She stood in the doorway before turning off the last light and whispered a single word, one she had never spoken aloud in all the years since the memory began. She didn't know whose name it was, or even if it was a name, but it felt right. It fit in her mouth like something long held. And as the room settled into darkness, she understood that she was no longer carrying the memory. It was carrying her. She would go on, not unchanged, not complete, but quietly accompanied by something that once passed through her and stayed.